So without further ado, we appreciate our senator being here. Senator, how long have you served as a senator? Since 1999. And you know what seniority means in our national scene in the legislature. So we're just tickled pink to have him here. He's been a great representative of Idaho and always been accessible, and we're just grateful he's had time to come. And so you will help me welcome Senator Crapo.
I'll do it. Well, thank you very much, Mike. It's really a treat to be with you. I apologize. We scheduled it thinking we would be able to be done by about 1:45, and so we've got other things scheduled, and I apologize that I'm going to have to cause you to readjust your scheduling here. I have to tell you, it's really an honor to be with you. Some of you have heard me say this before, but it's true. I can tell when I fly into Idaho from Washington, D.C., I can tell exactly when I hit the Idaho airspace, because you can just feel the common sense starting to come into the air. And it really is true. It really is, especially when you're coming from a place like Washington, D.C. You know, they say that Washington, D.C. is the only city in the country where you can drive from one side of the town to the other and never leave the scene of the crime. Well, I really sincerely mean it. It's great to be out here with you. And since you mentioned the potato, Mike, I have to tell you, the potato farmers in here know this, but we actually had to have a fight in Congress over whether to allow school children to eat potatoes. Believe it or not, because it was not politically correct to eat potatoes. It took us 2 or 3 years, but we got it done. And we had to pass a law to do it. And that maybe could lead into the comments I'd like to make. And if I understand, I'm going to try to keep brief, and I will try not to be a filibusterer, and then maybe we could have a couple of minutes for questions before I have to leave. I think I'll talk a little bit about the political climate we're in right now and what's happening in Washington. And let me just start out by saying everybody here knows that we're in the middle of an election, a presidential election. But what I don't think that people really focus on as well as they should is that at stake in the November election is far more than just the presidency. Every branch of our federal government, in my opinion, is on the line. Obviously, the presidency is on the line. Secondly, the United States Senate is on the line, the control of the United States Senate. And although it's not as visible as the presidential debates and fights that are going on right now in campaigns, the fight for control of the Senate is every bit as intense and engaged across this country as is the fight for the control of the presidency. This year, there are 34 Senate seats up. 24 of the 34 seats are held by Republicans, which means that there's almost a 2.5 to 1 statistical disadvantage for Republicans in terms of maintaining control of the Senate. And that fact is not missed by those who want to return control of the Senate to the Democratic Party. We literally, in every state in the country, well, in 34 of the states of the country, are engaged in trying to protect the Senate from flipping. If it does, and I'm going to give you an example of what that, just one example of what that could mean. If it does, the opportunity for us to advance and actually to stop the progress of the literal race toward socialism that we see coming in the country, but the opportunity to start advancing and enacting into law those kinds of principles and values and laws that will help us to regain some of our strength will be stymied. And then the third point, which I'm going to relate back to the Senate, is that given the unfortunate passing of Justice Scalia, the balance of the United States Supreme Court is also on the line. And this gets back to why it is so critical to keep the Senate under Republican control. As I think everybody well knows, Justice Scalia was a renowned constitutional scholar and focused. He's probably one of the strongest Supreme Court justices we've ever had in terms of keeping us focused on the original intent of the Constitution and causing the Supreme Court to be a court in which laws were interpreted and applied as opposed to created. And that's a very critical difference. The balance on the Supreme Court for a number of years now has been literally razor thin. By the way I look at it, and I think most people would agree with this, there have been 4 what I would call strict constructionist constitutional justices like Justice Scalia. And there have been 4 what I would call activist justices like Sonia Sotomayor and Elaine Kagan, both nominated by President and put on the bench, nominated by President Obama and put on the bench by a Democratic Senate. And 1 swing vote. So it literally has been about 4-4 with 1 vote that went back and forth. And I remind people when they talk about, well, maybe we should just accept another swing vote in this particular decision. A swing vote means they're wrong at least half the time, doesn't it? Well, at least to me it does. And so that's what's on the line. And as you know, in this particular circumstance, the president has put forward a nominee. His name is Merrick Garland. And I cannot conceive of a circumstance under which I would support Merrick Garland under any situation in terms of a nomination to the Supreme Court, let alone under one in which the balance of the court was so critical. Why? Now, Judge, he's not a justice yet, Judge Garland has clearly shown an opposition to the individual right to bear arms under the Second Amendment. And that vote in the Supreme Court was 5-4 when it came up under the Heller case a few years back. Those who want to see that decision reversed are aching for the opportunity for that 5th vote to switch. In this case, it would switch from Justice Scalia, who supported the right to bear arms and the Second Amendment, and it would switch to Justice Garland, who has already made it clear, in my opinion, that he would rule the other way. So the Second Amendment is on the line. And so many other important parts of our system are on the line. Not only has the National Rifle Association come out in opposition to him, but so has the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses. And this is not big business in America. This is the largest association of small businesses in America. And the NFIB has said, looking at his record, you can expect a continuation of anti-business type rulings from the court. So based on just those 2 factors alone, I don't see any way that I could support this nomination. And I can tell you that Senator Risch is in the same position. So the fight that's going on is the president has said, I was elected president. There's a vacancy on the Supreme Court. I have a constitutional right. And I would actually agree with him on this. I don't agree with him on much, but on this I agree. He not only has a constitutional right, but probably a duty to make a nomination, to fill a vacancy. And then he takes the next step, and he says, and the Senate should vote on my nomination. That's where I think he has a misinterpretation of the Constitution. Under the Constitution, the Senate has been made an equal partner to the president in choosing the replacement for a Supreme Court vacancy. And over history, the language there is to give its advice and consent, or to withhold its consent. And over history, the Senate has jealously guarded that right that it has to be an equal partner in this process. And going back as far as 200 years, the Senate has used different ways to withhold its consent when the Senate disagreed with a president. The Senate has, in the past, on a number of occasions, refused to even hold a hearing on a nominee which the Senate disagreed with. The Senate has held hearings and then can reject a nominee in the committee structure. Or the Senate could send the nominee to the floor of the Senate through the committee structure, but filibuster that nominee. And that also is a technique or a pathway that the Senate has used in the past in order to deal with rejecting a nominee which the Senate does not support. And then finally, the Senate has also on occasion put a nominee on the floor that it knew it would not support and did not filibuster that nominee, but just voted the nominee down. And so of all the options that the Senate has, my point to you is notwithstanding the battle that we are having right now, where the president and those on his side are saying the Senate has an obligation to use this one option if they don't like my nominee, the Senate has the right to choose any option that it wants to choose to do its job of advising and consenting or withholding its consent. And the argument that the Senate is not acting as it should under the Constitution is simply rejected by the facts. As a matter of fact, the Washington Post, which is no bastion of conservative thought, analyzed the argument that the Senate had to have a vote and had to have a hearing. And after analyzing it and looking through the history of how the Senate has dealt with various nominations, it gave 3 Pinocchios to the argument that the Senate has to have a hearing or a vote, and actually used the term that it was a fairy tale. And that is, again, that comes from the Washington Post. So my point here is that we're going to have this fight, and I'm going to stand, as I'm sure Senator Risch is going to do, on not even starting the process. And that's a proper stand for the Senate to take. Now, to get back to my earlier point about how all 3 branches of the government are at stake, obviously, the president wants to get this nominee through. And he knows that we are in the midst of a phenomenally intense election process in which 24 of the 34 seats that are embattled with regard to control of the Senate are in Republican hands, and would like to see the nomination battle put into that election battle in those 24 states, so that he can, if he can force a vote, that perhaps in some way he can force a nomination confirmation. And I just believe that the process is, the issue is too critical for us to do that. So I'm going to tell you right now, I have a very, very strong confidence that this Senate will not confirm another activist justice to the Supreme Court. Well, thank you very much. One of the great things about representing Idaho is, even though we have a diversity of opinion, diversity of party, we also have a very, as I said earlier, high level of common sense. And the people of Idaho understand this and get this. They know what is at stake. I was going to go on and talk about the national debt and all kinds of other problems, but I've gone on too long at this point. So let me stop with that and just tell you, I want to conclude with this though. It is great to see so many of you out here. We are in an election, and I think sometimes, particularly in small population states, people start to wonder if the East Coast and the left coast have dominated politics so much in America that the votes of the middle America and the smaller population, the more rural, often agricultural and other places, don't matter anymore. They do matter. It does matter. We lost the last presidential election by less than 1 vote per precinct in America. And that's probably how it will turn out this time, whichever way it goes. I think it's going to be a close election. The same thing will be true in each of those Senate races that I talked about. It's going to be close. And the idea that it's sort of like this, with those pushing liberalism and socialism so far outnumbering those who want to have a strict construction of the Constitution and a free market economy, is wrong. It's more like this in America. And we have the opportunity to make huge differences, and it has to start here, right at the grassroots level. I'm so glad to see all these candidates who are out, involved in the political process in one part of the system or another, because it's the individual parts that make the whole strong. And we've got to do our part in Idaho to elect all the Republican candidates and to make sure that we send the maximum number of votes to Washington, D.C., to the Electoral College, so that we protect our opportunities in the presidential election. And never, ever, ever give up. So thank you all for being here. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but thank you. And I'll take a couple of questions if you have the time for it. Yes.
I heard a news report that the reason we've never declared war on ISIS, like some other countries have, is because of the Republican control.
I appreciate that question. Did everybody hear it? The question is, Mike has heard, and I know you've heard this because it's the attack that is being made, that the reason the United States has never declared war on ISIS is because the Republicans won't allow it to happen. Well, the truth is that the president has requested the authority to declare war on ISIS, or in other words, to use military force against ISIS. And the Republicans have refused to pass his request. That's where the truth ends to the argument. The fact is that back when we had 9/11 and George Bush was president, Congress authorized the president to use force against terrorist and al-Qaeda organizations, and that authorization is still in place. The president already has full authority to use his power as commander-in-chief to attack and declare war on and fight ISIS. So that part is the bigger problem. Now, why not just do it again to be sure that we nail it? We're willing to do that. But the president, when he requested this authority, did his usual thing. He said, I don't want Congress to give me full authority to fight ISIS. I want Congress to tell me how many troops I can use and when and where. And I want them to make it very limited so that I don't have to make the decision as to whether to put boots on the ground. I want to signal to our enemy that we will declare war this far, but not that far. And what the Republican Congress has said is, Mr. President, if you want full, unfettered authority from Congress to fight ISIS, we'll give it to you again. But we will not pass your resolution which tells ISIS that we won't fight them. And that's the fight that's been going on in Washington. One more? Did I put everybody in a bummer? Yes, sir. I'm going to answer a different question first, and then I'll answer that question. What I thought you were getting at is, do we have a crisis here with explosion of government? You know, I told you I didn't talk about the national debt, and I didn't, which we have an explosion of. But we also have an explosion of government, which you just described. Over 21,000 new rules and regulations have been adopted by the various federal agencies in just the last 6 to 8 years. Over almost 500,000 new pages. And everybody in this room who's involved in a small business or a big business or any kind of real activity where they're trying to engage in business knows what I'm talking about. Because the fines proliferate, the county here knows the fines proliferate, the oversight and the abuse of the federal regulators proliferates, and we are strangling our economy. We are not only strangling our economy, we are strangling our freedom and our privacy. If you knew the amount of data collection that is going on every one of your individual lives by the federal agencies, I think you would just be appalled. And I don't have time to go into that. So the answer is, yes, we need to fix it, and there needs to be a fix. So the question, both with regard to our national debt and a balanced budget amendment, and with regard to the explosion of government, and by the way, we've got the bills introduced to solve these things, but we don't have the votes to get past the president's veto. And so your question is, some people are saying that because of that, do we need to go to a constitutional convention and have the people fix this with a change in the Constitution? There are two ways to change the Constitution. One is Congress sends an amendment to the states, which then 3/4 of the states can ratify, and it becomes a part of the Constitution. The other is to start a new constitutional convention, like the one that we had back in the beginning of our country. I have historically opposed the second route, namely opening up a constitutional convention. Because although I believe that the people should be able to impose a balanced budget amendment on this Congress and should be able to make a number of other fixes, although I think they would be limited, the ones that I would like to see put into the Constitution. I worry that if you start a constitutional convention, remember, all 50 states get to be a part of this. And who knows what will be the outcome? And what constitution will we end up with at its conclusion? And so because of the fear of a runaway convention in which a lot of terrible ideas would be worked into the Constitution, I have opposed it. Now, I'm going to soften my answer a little bit. Because there are those who say that the states could call for a constitutional convention limited to a specific topic or set of topics. And there are lawyers who say that that can be done. The problem is there are lawyers who say that it can't be done, and there is no Supreme Court precedent on this. And so the risk is, what will you do if you start a constitutional convention and say, well, it should be limited to this, but the convention does something else and submits it to the states, and an appropriate number of states ratify it? I just think that I'm not satisfied with the argument that we could limit the convention. So why am I softening a little bit? I'm still opposed, but I am starting to listen and at least evaluate more carefully some of the other arguments. And here's the one that gives me the most comfort in terms of saying, well, maybe we should try it. The argument is, it's kind of a fatalistic argument. It says, if we don't fix this, and Congress and the President will not do it, if we don't fix it, then we will have a catastrophic collapse of our constitutional system anyway, both because of the debt and because of the government overreach. And so we ought to at least try to let the states do what that constitutional provision allows, and let them try to put out a good fix. And then the argument that this is the part that's caused me to stop and think. The argument is that if it is a runaway convention and we aren't able to control it, and that the argument is that we could control it with enough states fighting to keep it limited. But if we don't, it still has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, and we could stop it from ever being ratified. Now, I still come out no. But I just laid out to you the various arguments that are being made. And to me, it's one of the toughest decisions that we have to make. Our legislature is struggling with this decision, or has been. And it's just one of the toughest decisions that we could make. So I know that was a really long answer. My short answer is I'm still opposed to opening up a constitutional convention. But I agree, it's got to be fixed. All right, folks, thank you all very much for having me here today.